Morning, everyone. We're going to be doing some notes for the short story The Pedestrian by Ray Bradbury. So you want to open up your class notebooks into the notes section, find a clean section in there, and you're going to entitle the notes The Pedestrian. Really, the pedestrian should have quotation marks around it since it's the title of the short story, and then also include Ray Bradbury. Essentially, today I'm going to be giving you some background for both Ray Bradbury and what's happening in the short story The Pedestrian. Today being Tuesday, just doing background for the story. Tomorrow in class, you will be getting your literature textbooks. You actually get 2 copies of the textbooks. One copy stays in class, so you can use in class. The other copy goes home. For tomorrow, you're just going to receive a copy of the textbook that's going to stay in class. I'll pass out a copy then that you can take home and keep at home for reading assignments, but that won't be until after I return back to school at the end of the week or early next week. So tomorrow in class, you're going to be reading the short story in your textbook. It's a short story, literally a short story, because it's from pages just 57 to 61. So you're going to be reading that in your textbook. You'll also be following along with an audio version of the book on Google Classroom, and I'll have you answer some questions. So you're going to be reading and listening to the short story. Ray Bradbury, the author, is someone who you're going to become a little more familiar with throughout the course of the year, because later on, probably in January, we're going to be reading his novel Fahrenheit 451. So we'll certainly be doing some more information about him at that time. Fahrenheit 451 is related to The Pedestrian, and certainly The Pedestrian is something that kind of inspires him with writing the short story. So, or with writing the novel Fahrenheit 451. So he'll certainly be a person that we become more familiar with as we go throughout the course of the year. All right. So you should be in your notebook. Title page: The Pedestrian, Ray Bradbury, and just going to give you some information here that I want you to be aware of. All right, would like you to write down this quote that you have in front of you here from Max Frisch, 1957, quote being technology, the knack of so arranging the world that we don't have to experience it. Max Frisch is a Swiss writer who says this in 1957. He's a person who tends to focus on personal responsibility, personal identity, where we kind of fit within the world. And certainly a key term, well, 2 key terms, one being technology, the focal point of The Pedestrian, as well as his quote here, and also the whole idea about us experiencing the world. And this is certainly a conflict, a contrast that comes up in today's world, in today's society, where we talk about, what's the whole idea of reality, experiencing the world, experiencing something like nature, versus a world of virtual reality, which with technology is certainly becoming a very dominating concept. So The Pedestrian is going to take a look not so much at virtual reality in the way that we kind of think of it today, but is certainly going to take a look at the contrast or the conflict that experiences between the natural world, the real world, and a world that is certainly focused on technology throughout. The pedestrian, by definition, is simply a person who, is walking in the streets, and that is essentially what our main character, Leonard Mead, is going to be doing within this story. It's considered science fiction. It's a chilling portrayal of a society in which people are so isolated in their homes that a lone pedestrian is seen as a threat to social order. So technology and social order are 2 things that certainly go hand in hand with this text. Ray Bradbury is considered by many to be a science fiction writer, and some would also consider that he is a fantasy writer. And he views those things to be 2 separate entities. For The Pedestrian, he does consider The Pedestrian, as well as Fahrenheit 451, to be an example of science fiction. And the difference between the 2 in his mind is fantasy is total make-believe. It's writing about a pretend world, an imaginary world. So for him, aliens or exotic robots, transformers, things like that would be considered fantasy. For him, science fiction is something that could become reality. So there is some, in his mind, truth or possibility could become, not be some, could become reality. Is his main viewpoint with science fiction. So he sees the pedestrian as being something that certainly could happen, that it would not be all that difficult for it to be occurring. The story itself, The Pedestrian, is published in 1951. So the timing of it takes place in 2053, which you'll see on the above slide. But it gets published in 1951, so he's writing about something that is roughly 100 years in the future, in 2053, that he could potentially see to happen. So in some ways, it's kind of a prediction. It's taking a look at the future of what he sees happening in the world, and this type of book is considered, or this type of story is considered to be a dystopia. That's D-Y-S-T-O-P-I-A. And a dystopia is essentially a frightening look into the future. It's a contrast with the word utopia. I don't know if utopia got covered in a world history class. Utopia is an allusion to a famous book kind of about a perfect world. A dystopia is a futuristic world where it is anything but perfect. So it's kind of a frightening, chilling portrayal of what could be happening in a futuristic society. And so Fahrenheit 451 is going to be considered a dystopia. Certainly this short story, The Pedestrian, is going to be considered a dystopia. And it's a very simple plot that's taking place. You literally have an individual who is walking down the street. This is unusual for that era, for that setting, for that time period. And so the fact that you have a person experiencing nature, experiencing the world around him or her, therefore they are considered a threat to social order. And a lot of times in futuristic dystopian books, you do have this kind of concept about how to keep people in control, maybe in some ways how to limit free will, so that you have easier control of government or something of that nature. But you have this maintaining of social order in this future dystopian world, and that is strictly done, or at least certainly seems to be encouraged, through the use of technology. Okay? As I mentioned to you, letting you know about the overall setting, it is taking place in 2053 in November, so it's in the fall. It's an unnamed city. A lot of folks take a look at the unnamed city, the silent city, as possibly being Los Angeles. The reason for that is Ray Bradbury was born in 1920, not in Los Angeles in California, but actually in Illinois, and then he moves to the West Coast, Hollywood, Los Angeles area to do a lot of screenwriting. A lot of his short stories, a lot of his scripts do become popular on screen with TV, film, and things of that nature. So when he's writing this in 1951, he would be living in the West Coast. So there's a lot of reference to the highways, cars going all over the place, or at least roads that would be leading all throughout the place, kind of like an empty city. And so a lot of folks view that as maybe being Los Angeles at that point in the 1950s. But again, Bradbury is born 1920, recently passed away about 5 years ago in 2012. So when he is writing this story, he would be about 30 years old, and again, writing about a future that he could see taking place within about 100 years or so. One of the main things that we're going to take a look at while reading The Pedestrian is the whole idea of tone and contrasting tone with mood. Tone is certainly something that we've made reference to before, the tone of a writer. While tone is the writer's attitude, mood is the feeling the reader gets from the writing, from reading the story. So while tone often describes the writing overall, the mood of a piece of writing can certainly change throughout, depending upon how the reader is viewing the overall tone that the writer is using. So for example, at the death of a character, the mood could be depressed or sad, but at the discovery of a long-lost friend within the same story, the mood could be upbeat and joyful. So the mood and the tone certainly can change throughout the course of a work. One of the things that writers have to keep an eye on is to make sure that the tone is matching their intended mood, so that the writer's attitude is in line with the feeling that the reader is ultimately getting from the writing. If those two things do not match, then there can be some miscommunication taking place. This would be similar to not recognizing sarcasm maybe in someone's writing or in someone's words. Certainly there's been issues, where you or I or other people have had a hard time picking up on what's the emotion, what's the intent, what's the tone of an email or a text message. But tone is what the writer's overall attitude. The mood is the feeling that the reader gets from the story. So the hope would be that if a writer is trying to have an ominous tone, that there is some kind of haunting, foreboding mood that the reader is picking up from it. And this would certainly be, things that we would take a look at in any of the texts that we've read so far this year. If with the Metamorphosis of Franz Kafka, the reader was getting kind of like a happy mood from the story, then clearly something was kind of lost in communication with the overall intent. So ways in which a writer can go about creating that mood for their reader to experience certainly could be through characters, and also it can definitely be through setting. The overall atmosphere is a way to kind of create that emotional overtone that can strongly affect our feelings, the reader's feelings. So what mood does this setting create? Well, the setting for The Pedestrian is on a cold, dark night in November 2053. The pedestrian, Leonard Mead, walks alone through the city. The streets and freeways are deserted. Dark, tomb-like homes line the streets. So you're taking a look for specific words, diction, word choice that have strong connotative meanings. So in this case, we would see dark, cold night. Walks alone through the city. The streets and freeways are deserted. Dark, tomb-like homes line the streets. So by reading this, you could certainly get a sense that maybe the mood is meant to be kind of ominous. There is certainly a negative connotation that would be taking place. So there might be some fear, taking place on the part of the reader. On the next slide, and you don't need to write down all the terms here that are going to be on the next slide. Here is a rather extensive list of a variety of moods that can take place within any given text. So we take a look, again, at what was getting mentioned in our previous slide, where we had terms like dark, cold, alone, deserted, dark again, tomb-like, some things that might end up being appropriate moods. Certainly the use of the word cold would pop out, since that got used within the text itself. Desolate, desolated might be something that would be pretty appropriate for what's happening with the pedestrian. Somber, tomb-like, dark, those would all be appropriate moods that would be taking place. If you were to think about other texts that we have read, so take, for example, Metamorphosis, again, looking at this rather exhaustive list, haunting, or nightmarish, melancholic, those would all be appropriate moods that one would consider with, a nightmare, having a person turning into a bug, all of these disturbing dreams and whatnot that Gregor is having. If you were to think about what would be happening within Oedipus Rex, when we read that, depending upon the viewpoints that you would be having, somber would again maybe be something that would be appropriate for that text. There could be certainly times of anxiousness, anxiety, when you're trying to figure out what's happening to Thebes with the plagues and stuff of that nature. And certainly it could also have a fatalistic mood to it when dealing with what's happening with gods and their predictions and the oracles and all that kind of stuff, especially with Tiresias and whatnot with Oedipus. So again, the whole idea is with mood, you're taking a look at how is the writer creating the atmosphere, the overall setting, the characters, and so how